Here's the scene. 1 hour past twilight on the night of a full hay moon, so an evening in June. An hour and spare change, and the last bend of the Castleneck River vomits out the estuaries and salt marshes and sandbars that is, by turns, known as Essex Bay and Innsmouth Harbour. Lovecraft called the river the Monoxet, but that was never its true name. That was only some portmanteau spun from Algonquin, man island fused with Oxet, at the river's widest part. Not inaccurate, as the Castleneck here abandons any pretense at being a river, and is instead only the sluggish maze of shallow streams, sloughs, impassable tracts of swamps, dunes, and thickly wooded islands prefacing Essex Bay, that is, Innsmouth Harbour. On this night in June of 1920, the hay-moon has only just cleared the horizon and shines low and red across the Atlantic beyond Ipswich Bay. To men and women alien to the decaying seaport of Innsmouth, that moon might bring a shiver. It might cause one to look away, because it could be the single eye of any god gazing out across a world to which it means to do mischief. The peculiar inhabitants of the seaport, however, revel on these nights. They strip and swim through the cold water out to the low granite spine of Devil Reef, and, by the moonlight, there they do cavort with the sorts of beings their slow metamorphoses will one day make of them. This has been the way of things since Captain Obed Marsh returned from the South Seas prior to the year of someone else's Lord, 1846. Possibly as far ago as the early 1820s. Sailing back on the Sumatra Queen with new prosperity for an ailing town and the gift of transcendence and everlasting life for all. Returning to preach the gospel of Father Dagon and Mother Hydra. But this is neither a geography nor a history lesson. This is something else. Some would say this is a love story. All right, let's settle for that, if only for the sake of convenience. Some would go so far as to make an analogy with Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. Though that may be interjecting an unnecessary and, too, inappropriate degree of sentimentality into what is to come. Once upon a time, there was a ghoul who fell in love with a daughter of the port of Innsmouth. To say the least, her parents would hardly have looked upon this as an acceptable state of affairs. She, destined one day to descend through abyssal depths to the splendor of many-spired Eonith to the depths well beyond the shallows of Geoffrey's Ledge. She might have the fortune to marry well, perhaps, even taking for herself a husband from among the amphibious deep ones who inhabit the city, or at the very least, a fine and only once human devotee of the esoteric order. She would be adorned in nothing more than the fantastic, partly golden alloy diadems and bracelets and anklets, the lavaliers of uncut rubies, emeralds, sapphires, and diamonds. What caring parent would not be alarmed that their only daughter might foolishly forsake so precious an inheritance? And all for an infatuation with so low-born and vile creature as a ghoul. The girl's name is, or was, if you dislike tense shifts, Elbereth Gilman, and on the night in question she is a few months past her 16th birthday. Likely she has long since been betrothed, and is only awaiting the completion of her transition. The ghoul has no name that could ever be spoken in any tongue of man. With a small tribe of his kind, he passes the days in the mouldering tunnels beneath the old hill burying ground, those passages roofed with long-emptied shattered caskets and the roots of elderly oaks and hemlocks. Unlike Elbereth, the ghoul has not much more to look forward to but a few fresh corpses here and there, the gnawing of dry bones devoid of the least scrap of marrow, and the grumbling company of his own vicious kin. Possibly, if great luck should some day shine down upon him, the ghoul may one day descend into the underworld of the dreamlands, and dwell on the peaks of Thok above the vales of Nath, carpeted with a billion skeletons, where the most celebrated ghouls never lack for the fleshiest of rotted corpses. On that night, when the moon was still several nights from full, Elbereth went with her mother and father and 3 sisters. It was the greatest tragedy in her father's life that he had no sons, to the nightly services in the Hall of Dagon at New Church Green, the same building that had once held the port's Masonic temple. With her family and her fellow inhabitants of Obed Marsh's fair community, she raised her coarse voice in the rattling, gurgling hymns to the Father and the Mother and to great Cthulhu. She much enjoyed singing the hymns, and as it happens, was said to possess one of the finest voices in all Innsmouth. Following the services, she walked along the wharves with her family and that of Mr. Zebediah Waite, savoring the muddy reek of an especially and unexpectedly low tide. It was almost midnight by the time the Gilmans at last returned to their listing and somewhat dilapidated home on Lafayette Street. Never before had the ghoul imagined such wonders, almost beyond comprehension to one who has lived his life in the darkness below a boneyard, as the cobbled streets, the gas and candlelight through windows, the fieldstone and red-brick chimneys, steeples, the widows' walks and cupolas of Georgian architecture, the handful of rusting automobiles parked here and there. The ghoul could not see, of course, all the signs of disuse and neglect that shrouded the avenues and alleys of Innsmouth, having no point of reference. Even the boarded windows and doorways seemed the product of amazing skill. The parallel lines of abandoned railways and telegraph poles that had long since lost their wiring to one or another nor'easter or hurricane were evidence of a carefully calculated brilliance he had never suspected could exist. The ghouls knew the world below, and they knew very little else. Indeed, he had been taught it was anathema to seek anything more, as such an act would surely be an offense to the gods who guarded and watched over carrion feeders. It was only happenstance that he chose to squat beneath the bedroom window of Elbereth Gilman. Most of Lafayette Street was dark and deserted, which, so far as the ghoul knew, was a normal condition for any town. So it was, naturally, the yellow-orange glow of the windows of her house that drew his attention. Perhaps then it was not happenstance, but quite the opposite. It may have been the inevitability that so often attends curiosity. Darkness and shadows were familiar to the ghoul. Lighted windows, however, these were a novelty. In a patch of weeds and beneath the limbs of an elderberry tree, he squatted and listened intently to the noises, all quite routine, though he had no way of knowing this, of Elbereth readying herself for bed. He pressed his ear to the weathered gray clapboard, savoring every sound. But it wasn't until he heard the creak of mattress springs, not until the light from the room was extinguished, that the ghoul summoned the courage to rise on his hooved and shaggy fetlocked hind limbs and gaze in through the window pane. It so happened that Elbereth had not yet even closed her eyes, much less drifted away and down to her usual and sweet, welcomed dreams of the bioluminescent terraces and silt courtyards of Yarnith Ley, or of that nameless sunken city in the middle sea of the dreamlands, which lies in the strait between Diath Leen and the city of Oriab. When the ghoul began softly tapping and scraping on the glass, at first she took it for nothing more than a breeze, causing the branches of the elderberry tree to brush against the house. But then the tap-tap-tapping grew more insistent, and she sensed in it both a purpose and a pattern that never could be attributed to wind and tree limbs. So she rose and went to the window. She was met by the scarlet eyes of the ghouls peering in at her, and its wet nose pressed to the pane. At first she was taken aback by such a monstrous sight, and very nearly called for her father, whom she still trusted to keep her safe from all the malevolent bogies and goblins that go bump in the night. Seeing the beauty of her, Another thing completely alien to the ghoul. He quite unintentionally, or at least without forethought, coughed out a short bark and a few words of wonder. Of course Elbereth didn't speak the language of ghouls, and this was only the guttural din that might be heard from any animal. But she didn't recoil, and she didn't scream. She stared back, and the ghoul tapped several more times on the glass. "If you meant to do me harm," she asked aloud, "would you not simply shatter the glass and crawl in across the sill?" As the ghoul didn't know the language of humans, not even that of humans evolving into that which may no longer be considered human, the question meant no more to him than his utterances had meant to her. Linguists would call this unfortunate situation a language barrier. "You would do that, wouldn't you?" asked Elbereth Gilman. "You would, and by now I would have been slaughtered and near to half devoured." Catching the absence of fear in the girl's voice, the ghoul raised its eyebrows and twisted its short muzzle into the grimace that passes as a smile among ghouls. Elbereth did wince the tiniest bit at the sight of his rows of crooked yellowed teeth, the canines robust as those of any wolf or black bear. She bravely pressed her open palm and outstretched fingers against the window pane, and certainly the ghoul took this as a sign of welcome. In response, he did the same, though his hand was not 1/100th as fair as hers, and his talons clicked loudly upon the glass, even when he didn't intend them to do so. "You mean me no harm," she said. "And if I raise the sash, you won't eat me," she said, having silently arrived at this unlikely conclusion. "You want to be friends, I do believe. It may be that whatever manner of a beast you are, you want nothing more than to dispel a loneliness that has long troubled your heart." Elbereth had always been a bold girl, and one given to questionable deductions. She unlocked the window, lifted it, and then stared face to face with the ghoul who'd walked all the way from Ipswich. Uncertain of what he ought to do next, he took a step back, lest he make some move that would startle the girl. All the men and women and children he'd ever glimpsed had been dead and consigned to their narrow houses, though others he knew had peered out at gravediggers, mourners, and ministers. But none had been anywhere near as beautiful as this human girl. Her forehead sloped slightly backwards, and she had hardly any chin at all. Her lips were uncommonly thick, if the corpses upon which he'd stolen and fed were any indication, her skin vaguely iridescent in the moonlight, and there were the faintest folds on each side of her throat. Her green eyes bulged more than he would have expected. Her long yellow hair was pulled back in a braid, and when she'd opened the window, the ghoul had noted a sort of webbing between her long fingers. "Well there," she said. "I've gone and done it. So, if you mean to eat me, do be quick about it, please." The ghoul did his best to decipher her words, but it was hopeless. Instead, he decided upon another action that he did hope would be taken as friendly. He held out one hand to her, that which he'd used to tap and scratch at the girl's window. His long arm reached into the room, and for almost a full minute she regarded the proffered hand with what Elbereth considered the necessary dose of caution and suspicion. The skin was calloused, with tufts of coarse hair sprouting here and there in no discernible pattern. The claws could easily have gutted a shark, should the opportunity arise, and several plainly unwholesome species of fungus grew upon the ghoul's flesh. But then, arriving at one of her questionable verdicts, she took the ghoul's hand. It was altogether warmer than she'd expected it would be. The ghoul, unaccountably pleased by the gesture, folded up her hand in his. And that's how it went on the first night. For a time they stood there, holding hands and staring at one another with ever-increasing fondness. until, somewhere in the seaport, a clock chimed the hour, so startling the ghoul that he released her and scampered away from the window and the elderberry trees, back down empty lanes and once more into the marshes. He did make it back to the bronze door of the mausoleum well before dawn. As for Elbereth, she stood staring at her hand and the smudgy, moldy stain the ghoul had left on her jaundiced skin, until at last she grew sleepy, closed the window, locked it against less amiable visitors, and crawled back into bed. This night, she did not dream of submarine palaces or of her grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins who'd long since gone down to the sea without ships, rising to the surface only on appointed nights to cavort upon the jagged strata of Devil Reef. Rather, she dreamt of the ghoul, of his face and the touch of his hand upon her own.